Mastering your own mixes can be tricky, especially if you've been working on your song for days, weeks, or even months. But hiring a mastering engineer isn't always possible. Maybe you're working on a budget, a time constraint, or you just want full creative control from start to finish. The good news is, it is possible to master your own mix. In this video, I'm going to show you how to master your own mixes to a professional level, the traps you'll face and how to overcome them. And at the end of the video, I'll be sharing my go-to mastering process so you can get started right away. Let's break it down. Mastering can often seem overly complicated and reserved for seasoned professionals. Maybe you'll think of Gandalf in a perfectly treated studio. But boiled down to its core, mastering has a simple goal. Think of a playlist in the genre of the song you're working on with all your favorite songs in there. Mastering is making sure that you can take your mix, drop it into that playlist, and it would fit right in. Similar energy, similar loudness, similar feeling. Actually, it sounds a lot like mixing. And to be honest, if you think about it, you use similar tools, you use the same pair of ears. So what's the difference? Perspective. It's a subtle change, and it's exactly why it's so easy to get lost mastering your own mix. So what do I mean by perspective change? So in mixing, you're thinking of details, individual tracks. Maybe you're thinking of how much 3K should I boost on this snare? But in mastering, you're thinking about the big picture. Rather than that 3K boost on the snare, you're thinking, does this song need more high mids? Would it make it more energetic? When you're hiring a mastering engineer, this perspective switch is automatic because they don't know what you've done in the mix. But when you're mastering your own mix, knowing this difference in perspective becomes very important. So here are the common traps that you might encounter when you're mastering your own mix. So the first trap is losing perspective because you're still thinking like a mixing engineer. So just like I mentioned before, you'll focus too much on the details. For example, does the vocal have enough air? Does the snare have enough body? But when you're mastering, you're only dealing with one stereo track, and every move affects the whole entire mix. So maybe you want more body in the snare, but if you're just focused on that single detail, you might forget that by boosting, say, 200, 300, you're also boosting the low mids in the vocals or the backing vocals. So it's not wrong to boost those frequencies, but keep in mind that you're affecting the entire mix and keeping that perspective when you're making changes. Another way you might be losing perspective is because you've worked on the mix, you have an emotional attachment to what you've done. Emotional damage. Say you've worked very hard on the low end, you're really proud of your bass, but actually what your master needs is a little less low end. Sometimes, if you're too attached to your mix, you might overlook it completely, just like subconsciously, or you'll be reluctant to cut the lows, even though that's what it needs. So when you're mastering your own mix, remember to zoom out and think of the big picture rather than just the individual elements. The second trap that you might fall into is losing perspective because you don't have a goal in mind. The danger here is that you don't really know what you want to achieve with the master, but you know that mastering is a separate process, so I should add something, right? So then you start piling on plugins, trying this, trying that, and sooner or later you realize that the mix sounded better without the plugins you've added. But remember the analogy that I started out with about having your song fit into the playlist. Keeping that goal in mind will keep you on track, and it'll tell you exactly what your master needs and what it doesn't, which is very important too. You can think of mastering like this. How little can I do to finish the song? How little can I do to make the song fit into my playlist? So remember, when you're mastering your own mix, the goal isn't to try all the possibilities of how the mix can be improved, but rather the focus should be how little can I do to get this song to fit into the playlist. So how do we avoid these traps? Well, there are two things that you must have. Number one, you must have reference tracks. And I would go as far as to say you must have multiple reference tracks. The problem with having no reference tracks is that you don't know how to fit the song into the playlist. But the problem with one reference track is you haven't zoomed out enough and you haven't given yourself a broad enough perspective on how to master this song. Because one artist, one song from one album only gives you a sliver of the pie. But remember, our goal is to fit this song or this mix into a playlist with many songs in your genre. And having multiple references kind of gives you the full picture of what's acceptable in your genre. And then you can make a decision what this song specifically requires. Another really important thing about reference tracks is remembering to level match your master with the reference master. And this is important because in mastering, small moves make a big difference. And this becomes very difficult to hear when you're fooled by volume difference. Volume has a big effect on your perception of frequency and compression. By level matching your master and the reference, you're able to isolate frequency, dynamic changes without being fooled by the volume. This brings us to the second must-have thing when you're mastering your own mix, and that is a solid mastering process. Why do I use process instead of a mastering chain? Because every song is different, every genre is different, every mix requires a different mastering chain. However, if you don't have a system, you're going to start trying everything under the sun. You'll run into the same traps that we mentioned previously. So that's why I have a mastering system. Instead of a chain of plugins, there's a chain of possible problems needing solved. And depending on what problems need solving, I'll look for those solutions to add into the mastering chain. So step number 1 in the process, frequency cleanup. In this step, we're asking the question of, does the frequency of this mix need to be altered to fit into the playlist? Does it need a little less lows? Or are there any distracting frequency buildups, harshness, that sort of thing? And if the answer is no, there are no frequency cleanup problems, then don't open an EQ. But if your answer is yes, then you can start to think, do I want to solve this with a static EQ? Or do I want to do it dynamically, like multiband compression, or even plugins like Soothe? The next step in the mastering process is compression. So here we're asking, is the mix glued together enough? Would extra compression help the final loudness that I'm chasing? That sort of thing. And again, if the answer is no, don't open a compressor. Not every mix needs mastering compression. But if your answer is yes, that's when you can think about what type of compressor to choose, how much to compress, and all that other stuff. On to the third step in the process, which is enhancing the tone of the mix or the master. So here we're thinking about the big picture tonal balance of the master. Would the feeling of the song be enhanced with some EQ shaping? Would the song sound more exciting with more highs? Would it make you want to dance more with some lows? That sort of question. Or does it sound a bit hollow and needs to be a bit more mid-forward? Again, if the answer is no, don't touch it. If the answer is yes, you can think about what EQs to employ. Maybe it's a good chance to try mid-side. So step number 4 is saturation. So here we're asking, does the genre and the master I'm working on require a clean sound or a dirty sound? Think about, do you want a more subtle saturation or a more colorful saturation? And then think about what type you want to choose. Then the 5th step in the process is thinking about how wide does the master need to be. Some genres need a wider mix. Some genres need a more focused stereo image. So you need to refer to the playlist of songs and make your own decisions. But keep in mind, wider doesn't equal better. If you go too wide, you introduce phase issues, and phase issues cause your track to be less punchy, especially in the low end. So ask yourself, does this song and this genre prioritize low-end punch? Or is it a song that can sacrifice a little bit of punch in order to get a wider mix? And the final step in our process is limiting. A big part of mastering is matching the loudness of the playlist your song belongs in. And the primary way to do it is with a limiter. This sets the final loudness of your master, but keep in mind that loudness is not achieved only in this step. The correct frequency balance, the correct amount of compression, and the correct amount of saturation, and finally the limiter on top of that, all contributes to how loud the song can be. So if you reach this stage and you find your track isn't quite as loud as you want it to be, don't just push the limiter harder. Make sure you look at the frequency, the compression amount, and the saturation before you push the limiter. Because if you just rely on the limiter, you'll often have to sacrifice dynamics and maybe even introduce some distortion in order to get the loudness you want. So that's my 6-step process to mastering your own mix. I actually use this process when I'm mastering other people's mixes too, but the concepts are the same. Ask yourself whether or not you need this step in the process, and if the answer is no, don't touch it. If the answer is yes, then you can think about what plugins to use, what color you want to add, and all that other stuff. That way you won't aimlessly try things to improve your mix, but rather you'll know what you need, and more importantly, what you don't need to get your song to fit into that playlist. Mastering your own mix to a professional standard is doable. You just need the right perspective, you need to be aware of the common traps and how to avoid them, and you need a solid mastering system. But now you have all the tools to master your own mix with confidence that it will fit into your genre's playlist. Remember to like this video if you found it helpful, share it with your friends who are mastering their own mixes, and subscribe for more mixing and mastering content. See you in the next one.